Let us discuss the grand strategy of China and China's interpretation of the grand strategy of other states in the international system. This is a chart from Scobell's 2020 report on China's grand strategy from the Rand Corporation. And you can see they broke down China's grand strategy according to four phases. The revolutionary phase from the foundation of the Communist Party until 1977. Here the key threats were the Soviet Union and the US. They were both military threats on China's border from the Soviet Union, as well as political threats to overthrow communism. The different ways of addressing it was autarky, selective confrontation, and on the domestic front, to indoctrinate the population in continuous awareness of the threat of counter-revolutionaries and to mobilize them for industrialization and modernization of agriculture. And you can see the priorities were primarily political, military, and then economic. Although it's obviously all three were occurring at the same time in a different measure, but the initial goal was to discipline the population under a party-run bureaucracy in order to keep China united. The recovery period began with the ascendance of Deng Xiaoping in 1978 to 1989. China was at this point economically weak compared to the Soviet Union or US, particularly in its under-industrialization. And so there were reforms and there were attempts to engage in trade with foreign states. And so the focus during this period was economic. Then there was building up of China between 1990 to 2003. This starts, or rather coincides, with the current practice of having 2 5-year terms of China's leaders that went through Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping. And again, you have an emphasis on China's military and political weakness, or rather, China became strong enough to begin a slow reassertion of capability, building hard power, emphasizing internal controls because of the observation that the Soviet Union's system and its allies collapsed because they weren't able to provide economic advantages to their population. The Rand Corporation claims the primary focus was military, but I would argue it would be political innovations to bring economic standards in labor and education that would essentially create the foundations for a disciplined population that could then industrialize, which is what happens in the next period of rejuvenation in 2004, where China's not yet aggressively challenging other states, but it is developing hard power. By 2015, it became a lot more assertive externally, deploying its navy abroad, acquiring foreign military bases in places like Djibouti, using military force to threaten its neighbors like Taiwan. It used information technology to establish domestic surveillance and control of its population. And so we see the beginning of the development of hard power. But even by 2023, China has a large fleet, but not one that can operate far from its coast. It has an air force, but it really is not a peer competitor to the US in that domain. It has a very small number of nuclear weapons, and it's struggling with significant social change in its population, which the government may not be able to control in a moment of crisis. So China is attempting to reassert itself as a great power, both regionally and globally, consistent with its domestic self-perception as a great power. Part of this is to reverse the artifacts of the century of shame, essentially the period of the early 19th century, the 1820s and 30s, up until the victory of the Communist Party in 1949. And the century of shame weakened China and reduced China's traditional tributary rights and sphere of influence. China is also in the process of updating its interests to exploit new opportunities not heretofore part of China's traditional interests, such as protecting distant energy sources in the Middle East, a blue water navy, and interests in space and the Arctic. China is seeking to develop itself economically in addressing territorial issues without provoking a counterbalancing coalition, or doing it in such a way that it could have its own allies. China's labeled this differently over the past decade, but China's advertising that it's seeking a peaceful, non-hegemonic rise. But with Xi Jinping, there's been a drop in reassurances from Beijing about its peaceful rise to the external population, and to its domestic population, again, many different slogans. It's promising a prosperous, good place to live, good quality of life place to live for its own population. You can see pictures here depicting the English and the French fighting in China. And you can see in the central picture a Chinese depiction of English sailors. Obviously they're hairy and they're breathing fire, which refers to the type of weapons they were using. So the grand strategic principles of China's grand strategy. So these are the domestic conditions for China's success. One, leadership stability. China associates changes in leadership almost on a moral level, explaining the rise and the fall of dynasties historically. This is a natural tendency. Herodotus did this in his description of kingdoms in Asia Minor. So it's a very natural human inclination, even if it is bad historiography. I noticed when I visited China, I took a tourist trip, the tourist guides were very reluctant to take me to Qin Shi Huangdi's tomb. I think there is still some superstition about the tomb that affects leaders, even if they're not actually superstitious. Symbolically, if something were to happen to the tomb, if there was an earthquake, or if people were aware of it, then they would focus on it, then it could act as a point of common mobilization for the population against the government. So you still have this sort of pervasive fear of instability of even symbols of past great leaders. So the site could be described as still sacred. You should compare this with England, for example, and Alfred the Great, who established a lot of the institutions in England and identity of the English people. English don't even know where he's buried. They forgot over the centuries. And other leaders who have been subjected to archaeological analysis and having their tombs dug up, this has not been the case. There have been no excavations of Qin Shi Huangdi's tombs, despite its location being known for 2,200 years. Second is generational transition. The youth of China may not have the same goals and the same willingness to sacrifice as the population that was born either during the Second World War or in the 1950s and 60s that saw a great period of growth. And this is significant because it means that the government may not be able to anticipate what the youth are going to do. There was a significant riot among youthful members of China's population that led to the cancellation of the government's COVID policy, which indicates the government is sensitive to some extent about the youthful population and was clearly not able to predict their behavior. 3, maintaining public support for strategic goals. Now there is a trans-Chinese identity. In moments of public diplomacy, particularly when the Japanese make pronouncements over the Senkaku Islands, you will see Chinese in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and mainland China united in their assertion that those islands belong to China. So on some level there's a nationalism that doesn't have to be promoted by the Chinese government. But going to war may require economic sacrifices and the sacrifice of the lives of soldiers, although the Chinese military relative to the population is very small, and therefore very few Chinese families would be exposed to the costs of having their children become casualties in a conflict. So maintaining that that level of commitment to a government project may not be that easy. While the Communist Party is hostile to images, positive images of Japanese and European engagement in cities like Shanghai during the Century of Shame, particularly from the period of 1890s to the 1930s. In cities like Shanghai, in the City Museum that I've seen, they celebrate that period. So there is a significant divergence in historical memory between the Chinese who live in major cities along the coast and have experienced great development, and communist bureaucrats and members of the Communist Party that have their power bases in places like Beijing, which are basically administrative centers. And number 4, economic growth. Without economic growth, without industrialization, China cannot maintain the resources it needs in order to assert itself in foreign policy. Here you can see the number of deaths in different economic campaigns with the different estimates. For the Great Leap Forward, which was a program by the Chinese government to exchange agricultural goods for industrial machinery with the Soviet Union, there was a push to not only increase agricultural production, but to accumulate it and export it. And because the government applied rules that didn't work under the different agricultural conditions across China, it led to a huge amount of mismanagement, leading to enormous famines. So here the low estimate is about 20 million dead from the Great Leap Forward. Now the Taiping Rebellion, of course, what preceded the communist regime. It was in the 1840s to 60s, and it was essentially a student who'd failed their entrance exams, probably because they were not from a family wealthy enough to be able to afford the books in order to study, and they provoked a revolt against government corruption from the province of Hunan. The province of Hunan is very fertile agriculturally. It's got a lot of natural resources, but paradoxically, that creates overpopulation, and every several generations, it is often the source of revolts, dissatisfaction with mismanagement. And this rebellious movement, which contained a lot of Hakka as well, Kejia people, pushed all the way to Nanjing. And the Chinese government, with the help of foreign government aid, as well as some adventurers outside of Shanghai, were able to eventually defeat them, but not before tens of millions had died. Sino-Japanese wars produced several million dead, and some estimates are actually much higher. You can see some estimates here are up to 20 million. I think the conventional wisdom is the losses are around 10 million, not 4 million as is proposed here. The Japanese defeated China in 1895 in the Sino-Japanese War, which allowed Japan to acquire bases in some parts of China, as well as exclude China's influence from Korea. During the First World War, after the 1911 revolution in China, Japan was able to extract more concessions from China, which were then in some ways reversed by the Europeans after World War I. 1931, the Japanese took Beijing, and in 1937 they started essentially the early part of the Second World War by landing in a coast of near Shanghai and Nanjing, and they pushed in and occupied much of coastal China, and that was one of the reasons the U.S. Set up an embargo, not the proximate cause, but the general cause. They didn't want Japan to be able to take over China. And it's thought that about 10 million people died, although here it lists it as 4. You can see the Dungan revolts, the Communist Revolution, which is basically the Civil War from 1945 to 1949, although obviously there was communist fighting going on as far south as Hunan province in the 1920s, and there's the Long March to 1935, where the communists took refuge in the north, in Shaanxi province around Yan'an. The Cultural Revolution, it says here 2 million. It's more like about a million people died. 1965 to 1975, Mao Zedong provoked a useful rebellion against authority figures in order to undermine those in the Communist Party who were horrified at Mao Zedong's misgovernance during the Great Leap Forward. And so he basically turned the tables on them and was able to maintain power through this cult of personality. And you can see the Korean War, China definitely paid a high price, but not as high as the price paid by the North Koreans in the conflict. So the international conditions for success are, one, a growing economy, which is very important for China, not only because it gives the government resources, but because it wins legitimacy for the population, from the population. The Chinese population don't judge the government's economic policies entirely selfishly. They do it altruistically. So polling shows that Chinese citizens will see whether other people in their community have benefited over the long term from the economic policies of Beijing. And the logic is, if they see other people getting wealthy, then it means that the government's impartial, so that even if the citizen themselves have not benefited recently or benefited at all, they can be assured that their children are going to benefit, perhaps one day, from that policy of promoting economic growth. So it's an altruistic judgment of the government. Two, U.S. distraction. The U.S. has got to be focused on something else. It's obviously the purpose of Deng Xiaoping's policy of laying low, of not having the U.S. building up an alliance coalition. There were attempts to build SATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, led by the U.S. It included countries like Thailand and the Philippines, and its purpose was to organize a NATO in the Pacific against Communist China. It was not that important with the passage of time, because the Chinese were moving against the Soviet Union. So there wasn't so much of a need for that. And also it was difficult to create an alliance that included Japan because of the general hostility to the Japanese occupation of at that time, many of the countries in the region were colonies, and the Japanese were rather brutal in their administration. So a war in Ukraine would be very good as a distraction for the U.S., but the U.S. is not much distracted. They've deployed very few aircraft. They've deployed the 101st Air Assault Division, and that's it. So the U.S. has largely not deployed to Europe in response to the crisis in Ukraine, and therefore has the rest of its military available for operations. South Korea is strong enough to deal with North Korea. Iran probably will require some American assistance to intervene against in the event of an attempt to close the straits. But a closure of the straits is going to affect China as much as it's going to affect Europe, India, and other importers of fuel. Number three, lack of coordination among the great powers. The war in Ukraine, the Russian attack at the end of February of 2022, had some stimulating effect on Western countries. Even if they're not mobilizing militarily, they are organizing economically. And that means China could be subject to an embargo. It doesn't have much of an effect on China's goals, because it could actually give China impetus to start a conflict knowing that they're going to be embargoed anyway. But it does mean that these countries will not be trading with China in the event of a conflict. China will have its trade essentially limited to fuel and food providers like Russia, and countries in the developing world that are able to somehow get their goods to China, although it's not likely given a possible naval blockade by the U.S. And four, distraction by weapons of mass destruction. I mean, there's several different issues here. First, China obviously doesn't want to become the center of attention from a nuclear weapons buildup, because that would be a sincere demonstration of hostility to the U.S. And so if they did a broad front nuclear buildup, it would in many ways trigger the U.S. publicly and domestically to create a coalition to deal with China and to deploy weapons and to have more explicit retaliatory strategies. But China's weapons of mass destruction at the level that they are, which is less than 1,000 warheads, is also intended to keep the U.S. from intervening in China in the way that the U.S. is intervening in other parts of the world. However, the fact that the U.S. Has been able to protect Ukraine while Ukraine is fighting China, and Russia's essentially not able to use nuclear weapons because of Chinese disapproval of Russia, and likely because many Russians disapprove of the use of nuclear weapons as well, and because Russia's not entirely confident about its nuclear force, even though it's got about 6,000 nuclear warheads, about half of which can be launched strategically. China's got about 10% of that. So the issue for China is its nuclear weapons are sufficient, they believe, to keep American interference in Chinese domestic politics, in the event of, say, a popular revolt somewhere that otherwise the U.S. would have exploited, like the U.S. did in Libya, for example. So now we will examine some of the issues. And the first is a focus on domestic stability. Chinese president and thereafter Jiang Zemin obsessed with unity to avoid a Soviet-like collapse that occurred in 1990 over Eastern Europe and in 1991 with the Soviet Union. China and Russia have cooperated against color revolutions. For example, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in March of 2005 and the Maidan Revolution in Ukraine. China's occupation of Xinjiang and Xinjiang, or Tibet, is in contradiction to Western norms of human rights. And China has responded aggressively to unrest in Tibet since 2008 and among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province. China is opposed to the presence of NGOs that may fuel domestic unrest. Domestic development. China's priority is reestablishing an advanced society, which is the basis for the legitimacy of its communist regime. China's grown very, very quickly. China, however, has become the leading emitter of carbon emissions. And this is actually not favorable to China because a lot of the pollution persists and causes long-term health problems for its population. And it's an intangible which, even if it doesn't affect the power of China, it has an impact on the legitimacy of the state in terms of its competence to administer the good life in China. China's rapid growth has provoked apprehension among its neighbors and peer competitors. And so China's concerned that the U.S. could seek to create a counter-coalition, a miniature NATO, involving the U.S., Japan, India, Australia, and the Philippines, as well as other countries in the region. Here you can see a graphic in 2023 of different bases. The bluish purple are American bases. You've got the red Russian bases deployed in different parts of the world, including Armenia and Syria. And you can see that China has a base in Myanmar and Djibouti. So at the moment, China does not have a significant level of base access. During the Cold War, the Russians didn't really have solid bases. They could operate out of Socotra, out of Syria and Cuba, but they couldn't deploy large numbers of troops there. Although during a Third World War, it was speculated they might be able to get access to these bases. But they were also expelled from a number of countries, like Somalia, like Egypt. So China may have the same experience where it's difficult for them to establish long-term bases because it gets itself involved in local politics. China, for example, has not solved the riddle of how to be an ally both to Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are two important energy providers. So in terms of non-provocation, China does not want to divert excess resources away from growth. An excessively large military could cause its internal collapse, as happened with the Soviet Union. Provoking a conflict with its neighbors could lead to a defeat or an embargo of its export-oriented trade or access to resources. China therefore opposes the China threat hypothesis, the idea that a stronger China will become more aggressive. Although there's sort of a two sides to this, Xi Jinping has, in his second and third term, made less of an emphasis challenging the China threat hypothesis and has leaned on China being strong, therefore do not challenge China. So he's leveraging Chinese nationalism and the benefits that come with investing in the military and assuming that the West is going to counterbalance China anyway. So there's not that much of a problem with the China threat hypothesis. China's principal goal is to foster a peaceful environment to foster its peaceful economic development, without which the government, the Communist Party, cannot stay in power. To alleviate concerns, China has restrained its military growth in nuclear weapons. It has a very small arsenal compared with the US and the USSR or Russia. China has also joined many international institutions and regimes and is seeking a bilateral dialogue with many states. China's got military relations with 150 states, attachés of a military type in 109, and military attachés from 98 states. China's in security consultation with its neighbors like Vietnam, Mongolia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Pakistan, and India. China participates in the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, the WPNS, and the Shangri-La Dialogue. China's even proposed confidence-building measures for the Taiwan Straits, although these have not gone anywhere. And more recently, at least in the last, since 2020, China's replaced those calls with military exercises in the Straits. So, immediate security challenges and defense policies. So, from the 1960s, China's defense strategy was based on national security by defense against invasion from the Soviet Union. It had 6 guard armies deployed in the north. Each is the equivalent of an American corps of around 50,000 soldiers, but they were mostly infantry. In other words, they didn't have a lot of trucks or armored vehicles. They had a few tanks. They had artillery, not a lot of air defense. And China's goal was to fight a people's war of attrition. And they had 100 million people enrolled in the militia with weapons that they could activate. And so the theory would be the Soviets would invade through the mountains in the north, and then they would be slowly attrited by just this huge human resource. And once the Russians had passed, with a much, much smaller military, Chinese militia could then interfere with the Russian supply lines. Now, it should be qualified, had the Soviets invaded, they would have done it with tactical nuclear weapons and huge amounts of nerve gas. So the losses would have been enormous, and conducting guerrilla warfare under those operations would have been very difficult, despite the large number of militia that China would have been able to raise. In 1983, China ended the People's War and began to focus on a positional war, because it had achieved a large force of aircraft and tanks, and thought it could fight essentially a conventional conflict and take the Soviets on tank per tank. It didn't yet have a navy anywhere near strong enough to challenge the U.S. In 1991, there was a Sino-Soviet rapprochement, and they both eased the concern for the land-based threat. The Chinese and the Russians pulled away from their common border at the end of the Cold War, and this reduced pressure on China to protect Beijing, which is several hundred kilometers of low-rolling mountains between what was the Russian border to Beijing. So that region no longer had the same emphasis for defense. And this permitted China to recoup its resources and assign them somewhere else. So it basically pulled the resources out of its army and its air force, which once had 4,000 fighter aircraft, and to reapply them to modernization and building up of the Navy. In 1991, the U.S. attacked Iraq, and China was alarmed because it hadn't anticipated that Iraq would do so poorly, in part because Iraq was equipped with Soviet and Chinese weapons and was fighting the way that China thought it would be fighting. The U.S. suffered very few fatalities compared to almost the complete destruction of Iraq's air force and a significant part of its land force. So China termed this war under modern conditions, and China assessed this to be essentially based on information warfare. The U.S. was able to use information a lot more quickly than the Iraqis, and this allowed the U.S. To not only choose targets for air attacks and to destroy the central air defense system, but also for land battles with tanks. American reconnaissance allowed them to maneuver and to initiate contact against Iraqi armed forces before the Iraqis were able to maneuver into a better position. So in full spectrum, the U.S. dominated. I'm not entirely sure it's actually information warfare. I think it's something quite different. I think it's simply a better trained U.S. troops taught to use initiative. Now, the land war didn't use much initiative. It was basically soldiers driving along in a column in sort of pre-designated paths with air cover. But when the U.S. did get into contact, they were able to exchange information very, very efficiently, and they were very well trained. Where only some units in the Iraqi military were well trained, and they'd been put under untenable strategic circumstances. They were bombarded for over a month by the U.S. Air Force, and so they lost a lot of their key assets, and there's nothing that Iraq could do to stop the bombing. So the U.S. had a good mix of highly trained soldiers who really didn't depend on information warfare. It was really high performance at the point of contact. So I think China's misinterpreted the information, buying a lot of radios and not teaching soldiers to think quickly and independently is going to reproduce the same result as occurred in Iraq. So China's new territorial threats are viewed as U.S. attempts to impede a Chinese move against Taiwan, Indian threats to Tibet, which China uses as a buffer against Indian influence, U.S. influence in Central Asia, or Russian influence that may undermine Chinese control of Xinjiang, and instability in North Korea that could bring the U.S. to China's border if ever it unites with South Korea. Now, one of the instigating events in the 1990s was the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy, which you can see here, and done in 1999 in Serbia, Belgrade. So while the U.S. is bombing Serbia, they hit that embassy, and it indicates the limitations of information. You can see injured members of the embassy and killed members, journalists at the embassy. This led to the Chinese provoking an aerial confrontation in 2001 that downed an American reconnaissance aircraft. So the concern in Beijing was, of course, the surprise success of the U.S. against Iraq in 1991, and again, a replay in 2003 that was even more dramatic. Developed states have a significant advantage in military technology and strategic maneuver, and China realized its way of fighting would have produced the same result. So they doubled down on a significant modernization of their force to mimic U.S. technology. So the priority for modernization, it was in space, having satellites for surveillance, and China has one of the largest satellite organizations and number of satellites in orbit that actually outnumber Russia. Focus on the Navy, nuclear and nuclear deterrence. China focused on the Western interest in what was called in the 1990s the RMA, the Revolution of Military Affairs. The U.S. Pentagon had a man called Andy Marshall who was the head of an organization called Net Assessment. Because it takes 30 years, and in some cases 20 years to build a weapon, it's important to find what the strategic situation is, because aircraft are designed for certain theaters. Weapons are not just made and then you wonder what you're going to use them for. They're actually designed for specific environments. Tanks operate very differently in the deserts of the Middle East, the deep valleys of South Korea, and the flat northern plains and the forests of Europe. So you build a weapon specific to a theater. Most U.S. combat aircraft of the U.S. Air Force are designed for the European theater in terms of range. So they have insufficient range for operating in the Pacific. So the F-35 is essentially designed for theaters other than Europe. So it's more multi-purpose aircraft. So the RMA was a thought, or rather a concept developed in that assessment to try to anticipate what the future technology would be and then to invest in it. And I think it was a mixed result because a lot of attention was put on information warfare, but it's not entirely clear that information warfare has that much of an effect. There's been a lot of talk of drones and cyber warfare in Ukraine, rather before Ukraine. But we see now with Ukraine, the drones are a good replacement for a individual with a speed transmission radio who's able to hide and guide an artillery. And if you have good artillery and good logistics and you have good intelligence, you're able to do a lot of damage. But drones certainly haven't revolutionized warfare because they're easily jammable. And so there's a lot of old style, broad bandwidth jamming that's occurring that's making cheap drone use impossible. So, and cyber warfare has not appeared at all. And none of this is a surprise. There have been observers going back quite a few years arguing that cyber warfare was never going to be decisive, and that drones are not going to replace the fundamentals of combined arms warfare, like the need to have infantry because tanks and armored crews can't see their target as easily, and they're vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. In other words, camouflage is super important, and taking advantage of places to hide in the terrain are far more important than technical evolutions. So China is focusing on what's called non-engagement warfare. In other words, focus on command and control, focus on information warfare, because that's what they think they learned from the U.S. success against Iraq. So, observation. Well, the problem is not strategy. As with China's 19th century development, the problem is essentially sociological transformation, which China's not willing to do. There are assessments, at least by U.S. Military attaches, of the performance of Chinese officers and soldiers, and that's really what matters. It's not enough to get the technology from abroad. It has to be put into a system. And modern warfare is most efficient when you've got recon-led attacks. So you wouldn't have a general at the top choosing a place on the map where to attack the enemy. Rather, you would have very junior, low-level people who would discover a gap in the defense, and they would call this up to a junior officer, and the junior officer would then lead the rest of the army. So it's sort of you have to turn the command structure upside down. It's not the general commanding. The general is the manager. It's the lieutenant at the very bottom who is leading the entire army and being supported by the general, because the general cannot see from their headquarters, even with an army of drones and satellites, where the enemy is. Because on the modern battlefield, the enemy is hidden by camouflage within the terrain. So China hasn't made this transformation yet, near as we can see, and it certainly hasn't had the combat experience necessary to see the value of this. So China underwent its 2004 defense revision, and it started to look beyond its own territory and to develop the technology, including rockets to stop aircraft carriers and Marines and submarines and warships, to extend its power beyond its immediate coast. Unfortunately, this has provoked a security dilemma in the sense that other countries in the region have begun to compete against China without necessarily increasing China's security or the security of the other countries. So we're looking here at the division of, well, the military regions in China before their most recent reform in 2022. So you can see that in the northeastern border, which is essentially the Sino-Russian border, there's been a huge impact on Chinese security, and there's been a large reduction in the numbers in the People's Liberation Army. Local force levels remain high to protect Beijing, however. By agreement, the Russian and Chinese forces are deployed 200 miles from the border. And forces near Korea have trained for a nuclear environment, in the event that there's a nuclear war a tactical nuclear conflict on the Korean peninsula. So you can see each of those diamonds with 3 X's on top is the equivalent. It's an army for China, but it's a Western Corps equivalent of around 50,000 soldiers. So you have 3 divisions in there, one of which could be mechanized or be a tank division. And a tank division's got about 250 tanks. So you can see the northeast, which is the area around Beijing, and you can see the Shenyang military region. So the northwestern region encompasses Xinjiang, which is the Uyghur region. It's essentially it's the northwest of China, which is mostly not ethnically Chinese, although demographics may make it that way one day. There are 2 guard armies there, each around 50,000 soldiers in Shaanxi. Local troops also deal with counter-terror operations or counter-terrorism. The Chinese have their 15th Airborne Army Strategic Reserve in Jinan, a military region. And so this is intended as a quick reaction force. It's light, it's airborne, so they're not going to have a lot of armored vehicles, but they can land. And because this is a region that major powers don't have access to, it's very unlikely you're going to get a large Russian armed force there. So besides the Russians, none of the other countries in the region have a force that approaches the level of mechanization that poses a threat to a Chinese airborne division that's landed in the region. So that you can see that region in Lanzhou, which is the northwest, and you can see that there are 2 guard armies, or 2 equivalent Western corps, each 50,000 soldiers. So the southwestern region borders India. They're deployed in Tibet, and this has been eased by the rail line that was produced, constructed between Gansu province through the Himalayas into Tibet. And this has made it much easier for the Chinese army to resupply itself, which it probably would not have been able to do if it was involved in a very long war with India. The People's Armed Police play a role. Most Chinese police are not armed. So you have actually a relatively low level of gun violence in China compared with, say, the U.S. You might have other forms of violence like stabbings. But when China needs to control a region, it's not going to send in the army. It's going to send in the People's Armed Police to deal with the local civilian population rather than the military, which, you can't use artillery to stop a demonstration. So it's a big waste of resources. You want specialized, well-armed police to deal with it. Now, redeployment is expensive. Moving tanks to the Indian border in Tibet is difficult, and once a war were to break out, very likely the railroad network leading from China to Tibet would be cut. And so the forces that China has deployed there are basically those that would likely be available for several months to fight off China. There are estimates that China can deliver 12 divisions. Each of those is around 15,000 soldiers. So you're looking at 150,000 total within 1 month, as well as nuclear weapons. However, that's assuming that the railroad system works and that China doesn't have issues elsewhere. So here you can see the Chengdu military region. Again, it's got 2 corps. The population of Tibet is actually quite low. You can see in the extreme left, the shaded red area, that's the Aksai Chin, which China took from India in 1962. There's a road that runs through it, which is critical for resupplying Tibet from Xinjiang province in China. That's essentially the old infrastructure. With the new train, you have a train going directly from China into Tibet, but the old train, you paradoxically had to get into Tibet from the west, which just shows you how difficult and inaccessible Tibet is. Most of those forces, the 14th Guard Army, is deployed on the border of Vietnam and Myanmar. So China's, because of the mountainous and difficult jungle terrain, you don't have a huge force buildup in the region. And although Vietnam's got a fairly substantial military, they haven't fought in a long time, and they don't really have the mechanized forces that can take on China. India is the only other country with a large military that could pose a threat. None of the other countries are organized enough to pose a threat to China. These are the new military commands. So we've got Northern Theater Command, which is what is protecting Heilongjiang and Jilin in the extreme northeast. You've got Central Theater Command, which is built around Beijing and the interior. You've got Eastern Theater Command, which faces on Taiwan. Southern Theater Command, which faces the South China Sea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And you've got Western Theater Command, which has a lot. It's got Mongolia to focus on, which it shares with Northern Theater Command, the Central Asian states, India, and many of the Southeast Asian countries, as well as administration of Xinjiang and Tibet, which are contentious issues. This is a Taiwanese music student who put in a lot of effort to identify each of the bases in China, identified with the specific unit that's deployed there. And peacetime units live in their bases because it's most cost effective, and there might be a training area that's within 10 to 100 kilometers where they, and multiple bases depending on what precise type of training they're trying to do, whether it's an artillery impact zone or a firing range or a demolition site. And so they would group with other units for training. So this is easily accessible on the internet. This is a zoomed out view of the different bases, and so it's useful for finding out how close Chinese deployments are to key parts of their frontier, particularly the deployment of aircraft at air bases and how close they are to targets like Taiwan or South Korea or Japan or the Philippines, and ports, how close military bases are to being put onto ships so that they could then reach Taiwan, and where the bases are in the Himalayas opposite the deployment of Indians in the foothills north of the Ganges Valley. So there is the nightmare scenario for China, which is a multi-front war. China sees Taiwan as a long-term threat and the likelihood of a conflict escalating there. China's solution is to have forces that are very responsive. And so they wouldn't invade the secondary country. And here China is implying support from a country like India. But the secondary forces would be strong enough to essentially close down the border and hold off that other threat. Now, there's the prevailing evidence is that India is not going to join the U.S. in an attack on China. They made it very clear that they're not a part of an anti-China alliance. But this is the kind of thinking that China has. They're afraid that if they're somehow locked into a conflict, they become vulnerable to other countries that may try to take advantage of them militarily. The Northern Front and the Sino-Indian frontier would focus on defensive operations, as it's much easier than offensive operations. And that's primarily in the case of the Sino-Indian frontier because of the weather. When it snows in the winter, the Himalayas shut down and the supply routes become inaccessible, and any military units south of the infrastructure inside Tibet would be isolated. And it's one of the reasons why China gave up a lot of land it captured in 1962. There's simply no way of supplying that territory, even with aircraft and helicopters. So in a Chinese 1.5 war scenario, China's main focus is going to be oceanic. In other words, focused on the U.S. in the Pacific, Taiwan, South China Sea, and focusing on South Korea and Japan. China is more secure now than it's ever been since the Ming Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty was not a Chinese dynasty, and so it always had a domestic contradiction that ultimately played out during the Boxer Rebellion and the 1911 Revolution. But the Ming Dynasty was the previous Han Dynasty, and so the current regime compares itself with that type of regime. And the Ming Dynasty was both militarily powerful as well as commercially very, very competitive with its neighbors. And it ultimately fell at the end of the 17th century in 1688 to the Qing. But at its high point, it had a coherent military strategy that was reasonably effective at containing the northern nomads, until, of course, it wasn't, and it fell to the Manchu invasion from Manchuria. So the constraints on Chinese grand strategy. Well, there's a general belief that China needs a strong military to function diplomatically. If China makes a claim or a demand and it doesn't have a strong military force, it's concerned it'll simply be ignored. Although logically, China hasn't thought through well the consequences of having to use military force. It gives China autonomy. It satisfies the elite goal of not having to compromise with other actors. But the great weakness with nationalist regimes like Wilhelmine Germany or Imperial Japan or Nazi Germany is that they don't make compromises, and so they have no allies when they finally go into action. So it's important to get allies as much as building up one's own military. And China's not quite made that realization because of the inexperience of the Politburo members in foreign affairs. China is also constrained in its use of force because of the security dilemma. Any steps China takes can provoke other countries to do the same. Japan, for example, is involved in a buildup which has substantial popular support. 70% of Japanese support the increased focus on defense against both North Korea and China. And so if China were to provoke a buildup among its neighbors, this would actually reduce its security even as it increases its power. This is one of the very early observations made by realists and neo-realists. Deng Xiaoping's Tao Guan Yang Hui, which is to lay low, was essentially a policy recommendation for China to be non-provocative for 50 years, during which it would be able to build up its economy. And clearly there's been a horrible miscalculation. This should have been at least from the 1990s. So China would be 2030, 2040, 2050 would be non-provocative. But 50 years would date that strategy back to the time of Mao. So Xi Jinping, like many nationalist regimes, just could not resist the temptation to harness nationalism to remain in power. This means that the Communist Party is beginning to act in a suboptimal fashion. It's beginning to sacrifice the interests of China for the interests of the party, and it's beginning to sacrifice the future for the near term, which is always an indicator of desperation. If a policy can't be pushed into the future, and it has to be resolved sooner rather than later by pushing the externality into the future, then it's a flawed policy. It shows that the regime is losing the ability to plan in the long term. So in theory, China's domestic culture is against the arrogant use of power. So this is consistent with Confucianism, but in practice, the temptation of China to parade its military against autonomous moves in Taiwan is irresistible. So there are persisting challenges. One of the big ones, of course, is North Korea. China has a state which is very aggressive, which is very provocative, which is even more than China, stimulating a mobilization of resources in countries like Japan and South Korea, and compelling the Americans to focus their attention on Northeast Asia. China, while it would prefer to have an unstable North Korean regime than a unified Korea, which is allied to the U.S., is faced with a difficult dilemma on how to manage this provocative country. In terms of seeking regional hegemony, China has anticipated the relative decline of many of its rivals. European Union, for one, never became a great power, and so never united in terms of its foreign policy. And if you observe the consequences of the Russian attack on Ukraine in February of 2022, the European Union has been fairly consistently not able to create a common security identity or security policy without the involvement of the U.S. Now, China was expecting the decline of the U.S. after the financial crisis of 2008, but China doesn't appreciate how many of these crises the U.S. goes through, these economic adjustments. The U.S. is a very efficient political system in the sense that it changes policies very quickly in response to bad policy. And there's very efficient economic feedback on the elected elite about what the population wants. Now, this may not always be a rational collective decision, and in the U.S. you very often have a short-term policy sacrificing long-term policy. But what it means is that the Chinese were reading essentially the journalistic reports from those interested in investment and finance, and for them it was doom and gloom. But in fact, the 2008 financial crisis was an adjustment that made America stronger and for the better and more stable. And any policies that would have delayed or restrained or slowed down that crisis would have made America worse off in the long term. So you had an expectation that China would quickly replace the U.S. and that might have been one of the reasons why China chose no longer to lay low. It's obviously a terrible miscalculation, and it's a common miscalculation among rising powers. Wilhelmine Germany made the same mistake. So China has, of course, forecasted that U.S. soft power would also recede. So not only the strength of the U.S. economy and the military, but also the cultural influence of the U.S. on other countries. And they focused on policies like U.S. President Bill Clinton's human rights policies that really didn't pick up anywhere and alienated a great many countries in the international system. And George W. Bush's attempt at democratization in the Middle East, starting with his 2003 invasion of Iraq, in conjunction with the Arab Spring. So these policies were generally seen as failures, although it's frankly difficult to judge these policies in the short term, because American foreign policy is both a great power impulse as well as a liberal impulse that work together. But I mean, ultimately, the liberal impulse is to use power to convert all the other countries into liberals as well, partially for human rights, but also for commercial reasons, because they can become trading partners. So it's not clear that these are failures, although they might have come short from what was advertised by those that were advocating it, like Presidents Clinton and Presidents Bush. So the Arab-Israeli dispute, Afghanistan and Iraq, did divert U.S. attention for a long time. It seems that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has not distracted the U.S. as much as China thought. China generally focuses on great powers. It therefore disregards India. It sees India as weak, although India did appear more important after a slew of nuclear weapons tests in India in 1998 in the Rajasthan desert. And so China sees, although India's economy is quite small, again, it's low labor costs for its military, and India, because a large part of its population already speaks English, is in some ways better geared to participating in the international environment. So it may very quickly rise and challenge China, even if it's not likely to get anywhere close to the per capita income that China has before the year 2100. You can see the chart here between 2010 and 2050, the pretty consistent decline in terms of a power index forecast for Japan and Russia. You can see the U.S. and the European Union actually declining faster in this index than even Japan and Russia. However, where the European Union has limitations on its population growth and there's a decline in immigration, you have the same immigration politics in the U.S., but the U.S. does see long-term population growth as desirable because it adds to its power. And so U.S. decline might be exaggerated. Here, you see the projection of China passing by the U.S. in the year 2042, which at the date, from the date of this lecture, is about 19 years in the future. So China is seeking to displace the G20 or the G7 with a G2, which is a China-US organization, or the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, plus South Africa. There's the problem of China's soft power. Soft power was proposed by Yale academic Joseph Nye, who was challenging the prevailing view in the 1980s that the U.S. was going into decline. The U.S. economy was 50% of the world's right after World War II, because the U.S. had been unaffected by the war, and most of the other industrial powers had been damaged by the violence of the Second World War, the invasions, the bombing, the heavy use of artillery. So, but the U.S. economy declined precipitously with the rise of Japan and the European Union, to the point where the U.S. in the late 1970s was about 17%. And this led to a dramatic change in policy. You have Ronald Reagan came into power with neoliberalism. The U.S. opened up its market to foreign imports. This stimulated a lot of competition, and it also led to essentially the breaking of the U.S. labor movement, which in the 60s and 70s engaged in a lot of strikes, which were important for redistribution of wealth. So it did lead to the creation or the increase on a large scale of the American middle class, but it stunted growth. So the 1980s was a period of economic growth, and the U.S. by the end of the 1980s had achieved about a quarter of the world's population, which is significant because the Americans are around 5% of the world's population, and they're 25% of the world's economy, and they've held on to that 25, 23, 22% share right up until 2023. So a very dynamic, powerful economy. A lot of people migrate there. Most elites, educated people who are commercially minded that want to exploit technology by selling goods will go to the U.S. So it's able to attract large portions of the best graduates of every country because it has a legal system that guarantees property rights, that provides stability for investment, which is very important. Financiers, above anything else, want stability even more than rates of return, which can always be destroyed by corruption. So China doesn't have much to compete with that. China reassures countries that it won't engage in intervention in the domestic politics, but that is, of course, not true. China interferes a lot in the domestic economies and politics of other countries, but it doesn't do it on the basis of human rights. It basically identifies different factions and then will provide illegal bribes to one faction versus another, and it does this on a fairly large scale. So China lacks an attractive theory for global governance, even if it's demonstrated an attractive model for economic development. So you have many of the same issues with, say, the rise of Nazi Germany. The Führer, Adolf Hitler, implemented policies that reduced unemployment much more efficiently than other basically market-driven societies. And this was attractive to a lot of people who were demanding that their governments, on a superficial level, copy Nazi Germany to try to get those same advantages. The U.S. had a similar state intervention model as Nazi Germany, but it couldn't be implemented as aggressively as the Germans did. And the Germans, their implementation of that model was not sustainable, and there were serious imbalances in the economy. For example, the Volkswagen, which was designed to be the family vehicle and can be purchased in installments, not a single vehicle became available to any family before the outbreak of the Second World War. And so that whole program was really more of a publicity campaign than anything substantial. So China similarly has helped its own population, and people are tempted to copy that model, but it's an authoritarian model. And while many developed states did industrialize under a form of soft authoritarianism, or at least the type that would suppress labor, particularly in the 19th century, which gave them a huge advantage. And developing countries are trying to industrialize while granting full electoral rights to their population, which is very difficult because you have a constant oscillation between the labor class and the middle classes over relative privileges and advantages. And if you don't have an authoritarian government, there's no mechanism to force a negotiation on both of those groups for some better, more optimal outcome. So China's model of authoritarianism is attractive for other reasons, and those other reasons are simply rent-seeking by political elites, those that want to stay into power. And that's problematic because, like, for example, Russian leader Vladimir Putin in Russia, you end up with an elite that is primarily there as a predatory rent seekers. They take assets from the country for their own benefit, and you have a tremendous maldistribution of wealth in the country. Now, the European Union is consistently critical of China on human rights, Tibet, climate change, and particularly energy. Since 2003, China has pressured Europe to lift some of the June 4th incident 1991 Tiananmen Square massacre arms embargo, but it's not likely that's going to happen. China has largely given up trying to appeal on that basis to the Europeans, well, at least since the second term of Xi Jinping. So the Qing dynasty, this is the Manchu-governed China, which had replaced the Ming dynasty in 1688 and was in China until 1911. They did have a grand strategy to reassert China and to reestablish China as a regional hegemony and to erase the century of shame. This is before the Kuomintang was created, before the Communist Party was created. So the inclination to reassert China's traditional role and influence in the region crosses every single political orientation in China. So China's third attempt at a large ocean-going navy was under the Qing dynasty. The previous attempts were under Zheng He during the latter end of the Ming dynasty, and that we talked about that earlier. That failed, and it was essentially displaced thereafter by the European fleets. And the Yuan or Mongol dynasty. The Mongols managed to reach and invade as far as the island of Indonesia, which is the island of Java in Indonesia that you can see here. Java has about half of the population of Indonesia, about 125 million out of the 240 million people that live in Indonesia. It's always been the core of the empires that are there, like the Majapahit Empire. So the Mongols were able to mobilize state resources in China in a more rational and efficient way because of their focus and because of the Mongols' ability to create an efficient military structure. There were also attempts to invade Japan twice that failed, for example. And the Mongols largely replaced the canal system built in China, which was done to protect shipping against coastal pirates, with an actual coast guard. So that the Mongols would, and having a coast guard protecting coastal shipping is much less expensive than operating an interior canal. And of course, the oceans are so wide, there's virtually unlimited space for commerce. So the Qing dynasty invested in its fleet. The largest of its fleet was the Beiyang, or Northern Fleet. It was the largest navy in the Far East and the 8th largest in the world by tonnage. By 1890, it had 78 ships for a total tonnage of 83,900 tons. It had modern British and German battleships. The German battleships were the Dingyuan and the Zhengyuan, and the Jiyuan was expected. In 1888, construction ended, and there was a dramatic drop in the investment in training. This is problematic. So the ships were bought to give the image of power. The Qing dynasty wanted the image of power, but they didn't have the structure to understand the source of power. So China may be making the same mistake today. Buying technology is not enough. You need to know how to use the technology, and this requires a system of open thought, or at least the rapid incorporation of sociological theories on how military operations are basically organized from abroad, which China did not do. So this was a fleet in being, which means it was a fleet that was kept in reserve and would tie down enemy fleets. Because normally fleets are virtually impossible to destroy in ports, because ports are protected by big guns. Ports cannot be sunk. And so if you were to have a ship move next to a port, a single hole in the ship will make the ship sink. You would need thousands of holes to make a port become non-functional. So ships normally catch other ships at sea. So you could have a fleet in being by sticking your fleet in a port near an enemy fleet, and then their fleet can't do anything. If their fleet were to leave port and go do something, you could chase them, right? And that would disrupt whatever they're doing. So all you have to do is, you don't have to use your fleet, you just have to keep it there and signal that you're ready to intercept whatever the enemy is doing. So the Beiyang fleet was useful. During the Sino-French War of 1884, which China won, they were able to deter the French fleet from intervening in the same way that the British fleet had intervened against China during the Opium War. So it served its function. It was useful. It had a diplomatic impact. In fact, in 1894, the Beiyang fleet was believed to be stronger even than the Japanese fleet. And at this time, the Japanese had not yet tested or asserted their naval power. You can see here the Dowager Empress, Cixi, although she was not the actual empress of the Qing dynasty. There was an emperor. He was much younger. And because she had the backing of the banner Manchu generals in each of the major Chinese cities had a Mongol enclave on the outside of the city, which hosted a military Mongol unit that supervised the local, mostly ethnic Han Chinese units. And those generals supported her conservatism because the very young Chinese, rather a Manchu emperor of China, wanted to impose a whole bunch of reforms, which were very quickly repealed by her. So the fleet was composed of 2 German rotating gun turret battleships, which were very advanced for the time, 12 cruisers, and 1 Chinese-built armored cruiser. So the Chinese were investing in shipyards. There are 6 gunboats, 1 corvette, and 13 torpedo boats. And there you can see a Chinese sailor, and there were Western advisors that trained the fleet. So there were German, American, and British advisors, and some French ships that operated with or were allied near the Beiyang fleet. So here, I mean, the Western view was that China's modern navy would easily deter and defeat Japan. And so there was no anticipation of Japan moving successfully against China. However, China and Japan disputed over their relative influence in Korea, which led the Japanese to confront China's fleet. So this is the 1894-1895 Sino-Japanese War. Japan rapidly defeated the Beiyang fleet in 2 battles. The Battle of the Yalu River, which you can see in the center top, and the Battle of Weihai Wei, which you can see a little bit to the south on the end of the Shandong Peninsula, which is that part of China that juts out into the middle of the Bohai that you can see here. You can see also the Japanese warship, Matsushita. So that's the type of ship that the Japanese deployed against the Chinese fleet. So the Chinese fleet Beiyang fleet was destroyed in 2 engagements very quickly and completely fell apart. Here you can see again the Battle of the Yalu River and then Weihai Wei. So the problem with the Chinese fleet was, first of all, corruption. China was run by a Manchu elite that were primarily focused on regime survival and not making the sociological changes necessary to be able to use the technology and win. Japan, on the other hand, made a lot of sacrifices. They essentially overthrew the privileges of the samurai to create a state. And you know, this can be quite traumatic in a formerly feudal system because you have a large number of people who lose their privileges. Now, the way Japan did this was by taking the traditional elites of Kyushu, who of course were naval, because this is the Japanese island closest to Korea and China, and then giving them large, rather senior posts in the Navy or responsibility for parts of the Navy. But even then, there were, in the period of Japan's industrialization, Japan used its formal military, which they basically modeled on the Prussian military, the German military, to defeat the autonomous naval warlords and feudal aristocrats in Kyushu. So Japan went under a significant transformation. China did not. Lack of training. Money was diverted. You can see in the Summer Palace in China the not very large stone patio in the shape of a ship with a steam wheel on the side in the lake of that palace that was built by Qi Shi. And you can even, I believe it's in Hangzhou, you can see the garden where there's a small tiny little patio in the shape of a ship made out of stone next to a body of water that Qi Shi saw and modeled, used as the model for this much larger stone patio. And I mean, it was ridiculous because it was incredibly expensive, and it took money away from training. Now, obviously that's a summary. It's much more problematic than that. Essentially, a lot of money was being diverted from training in the military to other things. Now, it wasn't specific money for training that was diverted, but in the popular press, that was the comparison made, that there's a stone ship being built that's useless for anything but a party versus actual training in the military. Third, there was superstition. In the first engagement at the Battle of the Yalu River, a Dutch advisor for the Chinese admiral couldn't find him. He had to go into the bowel of the ship, and there was a altar set up to the ancestors of this admiral, and he was praying for some sort of divine intervention to help him win. And the Dutch advisor had to drag him up the stairs to the bridge to actually take command of the battle. So we're talking a severe problem of zero cultural transformation and a persistence of superstitious manners of conducting operations, which of course gave the Japanese an enormous advantage. Number 4, a lack of unity. The Nanyang fleet, in other words, the fleet that's deployed to the south, which was, it's a Qing dynasty fleet. The admiral refused to cooperate with the Beiyang fleet. Now, the Nanyang fleet was not the largest fleet in China, but it was another fleet under another command, and it shows you how divided China was. But again, this is a function of coup-proofing. In order for the Qing to remain in power, they need to make sure the Chinese commanded military units were not communicating with each other. Divide and rule. So when it came to the battle, the Beiyang fleet, half of China's fleet, fought the Japanese, and the rest of the fleet didn't. And of course, once the defeat happened, China became so disorganized it could no longer fund its fleet at all. So China adopted a focus on rebuilding its fleet in the mid-1980s. Right? This was facilitated by a huge increase in investment in shipyards. So China shifted from a coastal to an offshore navy. In other words, a navy that could go off coast for 150 to 600 miles. China did have some patrol craft and some frigates that could use missiles in the 70s and 80s, but they're a very small number. The vast majority of the Chinese fleet was made up of small patrol vessels, which don't have any air defense, and they don't survive long if you have very stormy seas. So this is not a blue water navy. It can't assert itself into the deep ocean and deal with all of the meteorological challenges that occur in a normal ocean. So to some extent, this was technologically determined. I mean, China achieved the capacity to manufacture large warships, and then they started to build a fleet that would fit that. And if we were to put a name on it, it would be Admiral Liu Huaqing's Blue Water Naval Strategy in 1987. So China's current plans are sea denial. It's seeking to deny an adversary within 1,850 kilometers of its frontier with a combination of subs, missiles, aircraft, and ships. China focused on submarines as more cost-effective than escorts or aircraft carriers, mainly for the interdiction of U.S. support to Taiwan. But curiously, China's not engaged in a very large buildup of its submarines. It's been largely static for the last 20 years. They will manufacture a new sub every 3 or 4 months, and then they'll retire some old subs. But China's submarine force is around 60 submarines, which is about the same as the U.S. But most of the Chinese submarine force is coastal, which is fine. You want diesel-electric submarines. They're more quiet. They can operate in the shallow waters and hide, where nuclear submarines are generally a bit louder. But compared to the Soviet Union, which had a weaker economy, the Soviets could put 300 submarines into the Atlantic through the GI-UK gap, the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap that separates the Barents Sea, which is near the Soviet ports of Murmansk, and the Atlantic, where the Americans were going to send ships across the ocean to reinforce Europe. And this is a problem. China seems to be copying the Japanese strategy of the Second World War, which is not having enough submarines. If China cannot threaten U.S. commerce with submarines, then the U.S. can keep a war going forever. And so Japan, in the Second World War, reserved its submarines for war, and it attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, hoping that the Americans would sue for peace, and the Americans didn't. And then it was hoping it could inflict costs on the Americans in battle to get peace, and it didn't. And then they were doomed. The submarine force didn't have the design or the capacity to interfere with American commerce and force them into battle. So China's got that current problem. Submarines will allow it to capture Taiwan, but if China can't convince the U.S. to make peace, even after a Chinese conquest of Taiwan, then it's a forever war. And China's stuck. So there are issues there. So China's goal is to have a sea denial out to the first island chain by 2010 and 2020. So when this lecture was first written, And this was done. This first lecture was written probably shortly after 2000. We can see that China may or may not have. Right. On the one hand, they certainly have missiles like the DF-21D that are designed to hit aircraft carriers, but it's very likely the U.S. won't even employ aircraft carriers except in the deep ocean, and they're going to be operating aircraft dispersed on various island sites. An aircraft consistently can bring more tonnage onto a target than a missile at less cost, and so China's got to be able to deal with that threat, even if the carriers are not there. It doesn't mean China's going to be able to use its own coast for shipping commerce, which is problematic. It'll have to then create the infrastructure to import food and fuel terrestrially, which is not easily done, even with railroad connections and pipelines to Russia. So sea control is China's eventual goal, including the Bohai, the Yellow Sea, and most of the East China Sea by 2000. This was achieved. And to achieve naval global reach by 2050. Again, this is consistent with other countries. The Soviet Union had an effort like this, although the Soviets were mostly focused on land operations against Europe. China isn't. China has land forces, but they're focused on littoral operations against places like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. And they have some land forces, but they're not anticipating a fight with Russia. So China can, in theory, divert more resources to naval ships. That means they could build fleets and then deploy them in distant oceans. It would mean China has to build up a much larger logistical train. The U.S. had this from the Second World War. The U.S. could refuel entire fleets at remote islands that had anchorages but no ports. The U.S. could conduct ship repairs at sea. China doesn't have that level of sophistication. It could move a large fleet, but then it couldn't resupply it. And there's the danger the fleet would disintegrate. In other words, ships would run out of weaponry. And especially ships today, missiles are much larger than shells. And so a ship could fire off all of its air defense missiles in a 3-hour battle. And then it would have to work its way all the way home, several thousand nautical miles without any air defense. It would be, so ships today are not as autonomous as they were, say, during the age of sail or even during the First World War, when ships could go on long excursions across the planet and refuel in various neutral states on the way. At the moment, China doesn't have that kind of basing support. The People's Liberation Army was or is currently deployed in the Gulf of Aden on anti-piracy missions continuously since 2009, but those ships don't have a lot of, there's not a lot of ships there. It's essentially 2 frigates. Japan, for example, was offered military bases by the Germans in Mexico before 1917, and this was one of the reasons the U.S. became rather hostile to Germany and ultimately declared war on Germany. There were concerns by the U.S. that Germany would deploy its fleet in the Caribbean, and the Americans would have to defeat a German fleet in the Caribbean before it could re-secure control of the Atlantic and then resume international commerce. So the U.S. is very sensitive to maritime threats, and so we can expect the U.S. to get a lot more reactive to Chinese policies. The Chinese deploy their fleets in distant oceans. The English used to have a small flotilla in every single ocean and sea of the planet in the 1840s. But with the rise of France and the industrialization of France, and particularly the state-run investment in naval ships and the revolution in naval design that was going on in France, that actually superseded the English and the various war scares, and the French success in the Crimean conflict, led to the British reconcentrating their fleet in Europe over time. And with the unification and the rise of Germany after 1870, the British put most of their ships back into the North Sea, simply to offset the German fleet that was based there. Nazi Germany didn't pose the same threat. Hitler's regime in 1935 signed a naval arms control agreement, in essence promising not to build large warships, which they did. They limited the number of ships they had. So the British didn't see Germany as provocative, and it was one of the reasons that the British didn't react so aggressively against Germany. And as a consequence, after the German attempt to seize Norway a very large part of the German fleet, particularly its destroyer fleet, were destroyed. Um, uh, Germany probably losing 1/3 of its entire naval power simply in the attempt to seize control of Norway. Yeah, you can see that here the People's Liberation Army Navy had sent ships to the Persian Gulf by 2009 and past Alaska into the Arctic by 2015. So there's a general resource access issue. Naval procurement is driven by the Taiwan scenario in China, as well as the protection of the sea lines of communication. The problem that China gets its fuel from the Middle East, which is very far away. It has to go through the Persian Gulf and then the Strait of Malacca. The Persian Gulf has been a dilemma for the U.S. and the Europeans for a very long time. What happens if Iran or a Soviet airborne force who land at the Straits of Hormuz shut the oil down there? So there have been various plans to intervene, and the U.S. has military bases in the Indian Ocean like Diego Garcia and other bases in the region that would have allowed them to intervene to deal with that. A very large percentage of Chinese energy comes from the Middle East. So at least 77.5% of Chinese oil is imported, of which 17.5% is from Saudi Arabia and 11.2% from Iran. Now this changes every year because it depends on the political situation, the availability of prices, and the availability of alternate sources of fuel. But suffice it to say, China depends on foreign energy. And with the war in Ukraine, China and India have bought up a lot of the cheap oil coming out of Russia. So there's opportunities that come very quickly. But generally speaking, China's trying to wean itself off of oil. It has a very large supply of brown coal, which is very bad because it produces a lot of pollution. But China's got an enormous supply of it, so we can always fall back on that. And there are techniques that Germany used and apartheid Republic of South Africa did in response to embargoes, where they can convert coal into liquid energy like oil and gasoline. So China is looking eventually to have the type of the scale of assets that it can protect those sea lanes. But even the U.S. fleet, when it was its most strongest, recognized that it would have been very, very difficult to intervene and keep commerce going without regional allies to help it. So the idea that China can build up a fleet strong enough to block any blockage of the Malacca Strait is a very, very unlikely. China would need a very large marine force. Indonesia's got a very large population. They would see China preparing for this. And China's already provoked Indonesia over resource claims near Natuna Island, which is an important island the Indonesians have in the South China Sea. There are 240 million Indonesians. Provoking hostility against an island country through which your commerce passes through various narrow straits it's very difficult. It's when the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, what is today Indonesia, in 1941 and 1942, there are about 50, 60 million Indonesians with a much lower per capita income. Now the country's got a much larger population, and they have access to the kind of anti-ship missile technology that would make it very difficult to fight and take control of those the straits, like the Strait of Sunda, the Strait of Malacca that go through Indonesia. So there are local straits that China needs to focus on that are enclosed by islands, and it needs to have the naval strength to be able to deal with it. And China would be overwhelmed, even if it wasn't facing the U.S. Navy. Of course, South Korea's presence off the coast of China makes ships vulnerable in the event that South Korea would fire anti-ship missiles. The Japanese control the Ryukyu Islands, which are these islands that go from Japan all the way down to Taiwan. Many of those now have Japanese-designed anti-ship missiles with air defense systems. So in a time of war, certainly in peacetime, the Chinese can pass through those straits, but in wartime, it'll be very costly. Ships are vulnerable when they operate off of enemy coasts. They normally operate best either inshore, where they're hidden by islands, so the radar clutter makes it difficult to target them, or in the open sea beyond the range of land-based aircraft. any shipping going near Taiwan, going by the Bashi Channel, which is the body of water between Taiwan and the northern island of Luzon in the Philippines. The Strait of Malacca, which goes is where Singapore is adjacent to, and the Sunda Straits, which is the strait between the island of Sumatra and the island of Java in Indonesia. The People's Liberation Army's solution is to put a pipeline up to Pakistan into China directly, or to put a pipeline through Myanmar. But that simply displaces the problem into the Indian Ocean, where the Chinese now have to deal with a potentially hostile Indian fleet with a very long littoral. And India, of course, juts into the Indian Ocean, blocking easy passage of oil out of the Straits of Hormuz to the Strait of Malacca. Even if the fuel could go by pipeline from Iran to Pakistan, it does through indigenous territory like the Baloch provinces of both Pakistan and the Baloch who live in Iran. And those places are relatively hostile to the central government and sparsely populated, which means it might be difficult to move oil by pipeline from Iran to Pakistan. And in the event of war, India is very close to the Straits of Hormuz. They could block Chinese oil going from Saudi Arabia or any of the Emirates to Pakistan. And again, Pakistan's link or infrastructure, pipeline infrastructure that goes from its port in Gwadar in Balochistan that would be receiving this fuel and then goes up essentially the Indus River into China, past Kashgar, which is a city in China. That pipeline is narrow and easily targeted and interdicted. There's also the problem of the distant straits, the difference between the near seas and the far seas. And so we can see the Strait of Malacca, and we can see here the Singapore Strait and the Sunda Strait and the Lombok Strait, Makassar Strait and the Wetar Strait, and which are in Southeast Asia. But even if China were to secure those, you can see the other black arrows of the fuels coming from the southern Sudan, from the Red Sea, from Angola, which are and from the Persian Gulf. And you can see those three black arrows. So obviously China's concern is that the U.S. Navy doesn't have to exert a significant effort and can actually rely in some cases on its allies to enforce a blockade against China's energy imports. Now, China's obviously the quick calculation is that the Chinese population, the legitimacy that the regime has is the welfare of the population, and by converting to electrical power, China's going to be insulated to some extent by an oil embargo, because China can always burn coal to generate the electricity it needs. Now, in a time of war, those energy production facilities could be destroyed, but in the event of a blockade without a kinetic component, the population will do reasonably well, and China will take care of a long-term pollution problem. Now, India, of course, is also seeking to expand into the South China Sea, largely, not substantially, but largely through exercises with other countries like Vietnam, in order to pose a counter threat to China. So if China were to deploy a larger fleet into the Indian Ocean, the Indians could do the same to the South China Sea as a signal that China is vulnerable to India, and India knows they're vulnerable. And of course, India's nuclear program is focused on China. Furthermore, China knows that India would be competing for the same oil. Right? They're looking for cheap oil, and so if there's a shortage, India which is much closer to the Persian Gulf, is in a much better position to negotiate for that energy. China will also need more nuclear-powered subs. Their diesel-electric subs will not work unless they're based in neighboring countries, and India will not likely, in the time of war, tolerate the Chinese deployment in places like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Now, Pakistan, that might be an issue. India and Pakistan have engaged in submarine warfare against each other. The Pakistanis have sunk an Indian ship with a submarine, and the Indians have destroyed Pakistani submarines, or a Pakistani submarine. China could deploy its submarine in Burma. But again, it needs to invest at least in a focused, dedicated build-up, a decade long, of a nuclear submarine force to be able to do this. Now, China is trying to emulate other great powers that have succeeded and avoid the mistakes that other great powers have made. For China to secure the first island chain shown here in the slide, it would need to capture Taiwan, the Ryukyu Island chain, and the South China Sea. None of which are secured yet. There are multiple claims by different countries in the South China Sea, and many of those countries have littoral air bases. So even if China was able to occupy the South China Sea, the fact that aircraft could operate off of the coast of Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam exposes Chinese ships if peace had not been established. And of course, taking the Ryukyu Islands would cause China to have a direct conflict with Japan. To secure the second island chain, China would need to neutralize Japan politically, which is not likely. At least not likely without a large-scale nuclear exchange. And the Philippines, which is more likely. If you look at the Filipino interaction with Japan in the lead-up to the Second World War, you can recognize generally that Philippines is quite weak. It's moved up quite high on the ranking of countries with the shipbuilding industry. So make no mistake, Philippines is industrializing. But politically, it's quite weak. There are only 2 divisions in the northern part of Luzon, with only a handful of armored vehicles and a handful of aircraft. In other words, the Philippines is very weak. It's probably one of the weakest countries in the world, given that it's got a population of 100 million people. And so without U.S. help, the Chinese could almost certainly land in Luzon, outflank Taiwan, and then isolate Taiwan. The U.S. could not protect Taiwan cost effectively if they didn't control Luzon, because the Americans cannot fly from Kyushu, Okinawa, or Guam in a sustainable way and maintain a positive attrition rate against Chinese aircraft. You can see the Jin-class ballistic missile submarine, as well as this is China's first aircraft carrier about 10 years ago while it was undergoing training. China now has 2 aircraft carriers that are operating within the Navy, and a third one that is under construction. Here's another depiction of the first and the second island chain and the implication for domination. You can see here the first island chain includes as well Kalimantan and almost all of Malaysia. And so this is rather an ambitious interpretation of China's ability to influence Southeast Asia, where there is not only experience in dealing with China, but some domestic ethnic hostility. So in 2006, the Daguo Juechi, the rise of the great powers, was a series of studies that turned into a series of programs that emerged out of a 2003 Politburo report, 20 years ago now, where China wanted to ask the major question, what did the other great powers do to become powerful, and what caused them to fall into decline? And so there's a focus on Portugal, Spain, Holland, the UK, the US, France, Germany, Japan, and Russia. China found that success depended on maritime trade defended by a navy. So China's interest was to focus on how land powers venture towards maritime focuses. Right off the bat, there was a concession that China respects Western institutions. This was conceded. Now, it's not clear to what extent China understands Western institutions and why they contributed to order. The study of bureaucracy is the core of the study of power. You have an administrative elite who are very well educated but are much less well paid or remunerated than the commercial class that they govern. So the commercial class's temptation is to bribe the bureaucracy and to fragment it and to put it in abeyance to business interests, which is only one small class of society that could become predatorial. And if you look at the oligarchs in Russia in 2023, that's exactly what happened within Vladimir Putin's regime. When you have an efficient bureaucracy that can resist these temptations, normally because they have a strong political culture, you have a system like in Japan. You had a Japanese military bureaucracy that was basically established during the Tokugawa shogunate and by Hideyoshi. And when Japan failed in its invasion by Hideyoshi of Korea, the Ming Dynasty expelled them along with the Koreans, Japan was shut off from the world for 250 years. But they had a bureaucracy that was aware of firearms technology. They had used it. They banned it. But they were also on the lookout for other technology. And so Japan, nevertheless, their bureaucracy absorbed engineering knowledge, medical knowledge, and knowledge of basic sciences like calculus. So when Japan was ultimately opened up by the US, they modernized very quickly. Much of the developing world today is the developing world because they don't have a bureaucracy. In the English tradition, the British were able to build an empire out of a truly multi-ethnic and non-united population in England. Forget Scotland or Ireland, just Wales and England. This is a country with significant regional differences, and certainly the culture is not maritime. Parts of England are maritime. The bureaucracy there is a peculiar combination of a legal system created by a monarchy that then became subject to its own legal system, which is important for principles of justice and legitimacy. But also you had a bureaucracy designed by Samuel Pepys, spelled P-E-P-Y-S, a very important figure in English history because he created the system that allowed the British to build a navy and administer it efficiently. Now, by modern standards, there's an enormous amount of corruption. But by the standards of the fleets of other countries, it was very efficient. The Spanish didn't have a national fleet until about 200 years after they started building their empire. The Spanish would rent ships from civilian merchants. So there might have been Spanish galleons, a few ships, but the navy, for the most part, was actually quite small. Spain was, despite being surrounded by water, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, was primarily a terrestrial power. And so its naval institutions were significantly backward. So China may not understand what it means when it says it respects Western institutions. So Holland is a particular model for China because it faced both terrestrial and maritime challenges. And of course, in the history of the Netherlands, there was a distinct move away from democracy towards being ruled by a monarchy in order to unite the provinces. And so you can see this assumption that all countries are moving towards liberal democracy is not always true. Countries under military threat can revert to authoritarian systems of governance and replace democracy when people feel insecure. And Holland was under constant threat from France and their allies. So China's main focus was, can land powers transform themselves into naval powers? So Portugal. It was a significant power from 1415 to 1810, although by the latter end its power was largely dependent on an alliance it had with the English. Portugal had internal unity and a national focus on technology. In other words, a deliberate opening of institutes by the monarchy to educate its population on how to operate ships, both in the military sense and for commerce. And the commerce, which meant trading all the way to the Far East, meant knowing how to build ships and to navigate efficiently and to survive storms. And so the whole issue of engineering tied into making a profit. Portugal was able to do this because of a sound national strategy. Now, it didn't mean it was without blunder. Early on, after the Reconquista, in which the Spanish and the Portuguese eventually pushed out the Muslim rulers of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal made a number of efforts to land forces in North Africa, some of which were disasters, and the king himself was killed. So it was an experimental growth process with a great many failures, but Portugal was doing more things correctly than anyone else. And this is one of the reasons why, in many ways, it was more successful than Spain in expanding influence and trade through ships. Now, Spain declined as a result of importing expensive luxuries instead of improving domestic economy. It had a failure to focus on naval technology, and essentially its importance of failure of naval power that was influenced in part by the focus on land power. Because Spain was constantly having to deal with issues in Italy and France, it couldn't exclusively focus on maritime operations, or at least maritime operations other than galley operations, which are rowed vessels in the Mediterranean. There was an attempt to create a bureaucracy around Madrid, which was the capital of Castile and Aragon, but it failed. The aristocratic elite resisted their taxation, and this freedom and decentralization led to a much weaker state. So although you had some pretty powerful Habsburg monarchs who were able to rule both Spain and the regions around Austria, Spain was inefficient, essentially inefficient government that in the long term caused it to fall behind militarily compared to, say, the English or the French. Holland was a commercial empire and a source of a great many innovations in accounting. Rotterdam, which was one of the largest ports there, had went from 1,800 ships to 10,000 ships, organized around a merchant elite. They controlled 80% of all the shipping of non-littoral trade. In other words, if you were conducting trade in your region and you just had to go up or down the coast, that was mostly local trade. All the other trade, the trade that went from a country across an ocean or across a sea outside of the Mediterranean, were dominated by the Dutch. And in addition to that, the Dutch were able to run their operations efficiently. They had the institutional and legal instruments to set up corporations in which you had shares. And this would, one of the big issues is how to create a common venture where people can trust each other rather than having individual efforts that could never concentrate to build something as expensive as a ship. So Holland solved this problem through its commercial and legal innovations, primarily legal innovations. And this led to an enormous amount of power, but commercial power didn't as easily translate into land power and naval power. And there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars. Ultimately, the Dutch, which was really a collection of private ship owners and powerful merchants influencing politics, eventually they were defeated by the English, who had a much more efficient government system for organizing the fleet, and the legislatures, which housed the merchants that conducted the policies for this type of economic exploitation, ultimately lost to a monarchy, the William of Orange, not William of Orange, but the Orange family. So you can see the possession of the East Indies, what is today Indonesia, which is very important for the Dutch because of the spices that it brought in, as well as many other parts of the world. Some of it, like New Amsterdam, later became New York when it was captured by the British after 1713. So France under Louis XIV, but particularly under the administrators like the Cardinal Richelieu and Colbert, that allowed for, and the diplomat Talleyrand, that allowed for leaders like Bonaparte or even Napoleon III when France asserted itself in the colonies before 1870 and after 1870. So France, in some ways, after the fall of the Roman Empire, became the strongest center of Europe, even stronger than the Byzantine Empire. It was very difficult to conquer France because it had an efficient administrative state under the Franks, an efficient feudal system. It had a high level of production of metals, which was needed for warfare. It had a very efficient agricultural base compared to other political systems in Europe, and it essentially became consequently the most powerful state in Europe up until the early modern period, and then other countries emerged to counter it. But even then, it persisted, as it does today, as one of the leading powers able to conduct serial manufacture of thermonuclear weapons. France is always needed an army to deal with its various terrestrial threats, whether coming from Germany or the various powers in Germany, the Habsburgs that are farther afield, or the Iberian Peninsula, or Italy. And so this need for an army has created a state-run bureaucracy that has tended to be authoritarian because of the needs of having to maintain central control for the army. So in terms of political innovation, it's always been somewhat behind England, which hasn't been burdened with the negative effect of an army on political decision-making. China, obviously is interested in counter-blockades, how to stop other countries from blockading you. But for the French, they're also interested in the guerre de course, or the French strategy of not being able to defeat the British Navy, despite many attempts in many different wars, but with a focus on destroying British commerce through raiding with privateers, or quick raiders that would stop British commerce. And the French consistently failed with this. During the Napoleonic Wars, the French cut off British commerce through the ports. And it was the fact that Russia refused to cooperate with Napoleon that led Napoleon to advance on Moscow in 1812. But even then, French boots were provided by English finance that was smuggled through various ports. So it's difficult to stop all commerce when you have the British able to move goods around to where they're wanted. More recently, the Chinese have focused on dramatic collapses of the French state. 1870, when attacked by the Prussians, and 1940, when attacked by Germany, even though the French performed quite efficiently during the Napoleonic Wars and performed remarkably well during the First World War, 1914 to 1918, ultimately defeating Germany. So China, of course, is afraid of the public morale failure that could occur within China. They don't really have an answer to it because it doesn't appear that the Chinese really understand how France dramatically failed. And it has to do, of course, with when you have an authoritarian system and you're trying to evolve your institutions at the same time you have class warfare and immigration resulting from industrialization, you're going to get a lot of oscillation of class politics. And sometimes this can be so intense it undermines the political system. So the focus on England is from the period of 1600 to 1950, and one of the leading authors for this is Paul Kennedy at Yale University. But he wrote his book when he was at the University of Hull, examining the rise and decline of the British fleet, and arguing that it was largely determined by the British economy and what the British were able to achieve. For China, England is a model of innovation, although not government-directed innovation. The English had a glorious revolution as well as a proper revolution in its civil war, which is actually a revolution. They overthrew the monarch. In the Glorious Revolution, they replaced one monarch with another over religious disputes. England, of course, was the beginning of the location for the Industrial Revolution, which started actually, in some aspects of it, started long before the 18th century. The English have been very successful in maritime and great power competition, in capitalism, meaning the aggregation of investment for large projects, particularly the rule of law that creates legitimacy. It was able to resist overstretch resulting from colonialism. It would be able to conquer foreign territories and then give them up before it became a significant drain. It's recognized that it's a small country. There's severe limitations of land space. It's not a major power on the scale of the US, Russia, Brazil, India, or China. Much smaller population. Here you can see a British submarine. That's a nuclear test conducted by the British. In red are different parts of the world that were colonies of the English during their second empire after the American War of Independence. The British occupied, of course, much larger areas than this in times of war. So the British obviously were very dynamic for several centuries. China's, of course, very interested in Germany. They recognized that Germany had a very skilled population. There was, at least for the Germans, they thought they had a shortage of living space, particularly agricultural land. China believed that these tensions were channeled into belligerence because of the geopolitics, because of the general insecurity of the German people. The lesson for the Chinese is that you want to choose the path of peaceful development. Repeated warfare because of nationalism against all your neighbors is a recipe for being surrounded and destroyed by a much larger coalition. One of the missed lessons of the Germans is that submarine warfare is not decisive. So China needs, there's a big debate, but it needs to recognize that submarine warfare is useful for inflicting costs, but it's not going to win a war for you. You need to be able to impose costs on an opponent, and for that you need a navy with reach. My perspective on Germany is, like France, you have this dilemma of the need for an authoritarian system in order to aggregate the taxation to create an army to deal with multiple terrestrial threats. And for Germany, which was actually divided before 1870, although there are various group legislatures, and before Napoleon, you had the Holy Roman Empire, where you had a means of electing. Long before Napoleon, but you had the remnants of an electoral imperial system. But suffice it to say, the German experience of war during the 30 Years' War killed about a quarter of the German population, maybe a fifth of the population, and this led to strong, persistent public support for militarization of society, meaning mobilization. And after Napoleon's defeat in his invasion of Russia, Germany had a revival of nationalism that largely carried through. This is 1812, 1813, largely led through until 1870. And but the big lesson is from Germany, it's just dysfunctional foreign policy that led to repeated failed conflicts with its neighbors, and each time it lost more and more territory. Now, Japan, again, for China, the Chinese believed that Japan had institutional defects that led to external aggression coupled with coordinated counterbalancing policies that were largely a failure. In effect, Japan engaged in a high-risk strategy to capture territories slowly. 1895, 1896, war against China, 1904, 1905, war against Russia, and then 1931, the essentially a partial invasion of China, and then the invasion is resumed in 1937. So, and each time it produced more and more hostility among other great powers. The internal modernization led to a shift to militarism, but I'm not sure that's what the Chinese believe. But it's far more likely that the need to have a strong state to create development allowed for the type of political centralization that also allows militarism to take control. And the economic slowdown of the 1920s and 30s impacted Japan severely and gave a lot of political influence to the military to try to resolve that problem. Ultimately, Japan, while it had a very technically efficient military in terms of its training, particularly the Navy, it had a very defective diplomatic strategy. It's not clear that China's learned that lesson. So this was a fantasy East Asian co-prosperity sphere that the Japanese thought they could impose if they could somehow win World War II, which was very, very sort of journalistic interpretation of what they can do and what they sold to the less sophisticated parts of their population. Japan's real goal was to slow down the increased power in China, because the Japanese recognized that one day China would be so powerful Japan could no longer influence it, and then so it'd be to hold off the Americans and the Russians at the same time that they took over enough of China to be able to neutralize China's ability to grow. So this here is sort of the fantasy version that was completely unattainable. Japan was not able to take over China. because the U.S. Maneuvered in time to make sure that was not going to happen, and in order for Japan to be able to have a chance at that policy, they struck at Pearl Harbor, which brought in the U.S. and its allies that were probably going to fight Japan later anyway. So Russia is a very important interest to China because it's a large Asian state. It has a large series of terrestrial threats, just like China, and it's had a navy on the side. And plus, it's technologically advanced, and so in many ways, China's emulating some of the institutions in Russia. It also sees in Russia the warning of what happens when your political institutions are no longer legitimate because of a failed economic program. Russia's maritime transportation attempt failed. It never achieved the level of influence that Admiral Gorshkov, for example, in the 1980s thought was possible. Because despite military development and the openness to foreign ideas in Russia, it couldn't leverage the technology to build a cost-effective fleet that could survive the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fleet that was built was very large and inefficient and very expensive, and so the Navy suffered a very large loss of ships that were simply not funded with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, on the broader side, China recognizes that if it's caught in an arms race with the U.S., which means a significant diversion of funds from economic development to military arms, then it's going to politically suffer. And the great many Chinese in China have an expectation of getting jobs and prosperity, which is what China's been promising them. Now, the U.S. has been really a major power since 1898, when it built up its fleet in order to deal with the possibility of a German intervention in the Caribbean and to reassert itself, particularly after it seized the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Guantanamo in Cuba in the Spanish-American War. And so since then, it's built up a large fleet. China recognizes that the Americans have a very strong political culture. They love their country. And there's, of course, a lot of disputes when you look at things journalistically. But in terms of the U.S.'s ability to generate military power, it has a huge advantage compared to other states. It's able to incorporate immigrants, which other countries in the world, most of them, are not able to do. It has a culture that's focused on high productivity, and because of the free market system, people work long hours, and they tend to be much more productive than other countries in the world, compared to, say, for example, Japan, where you have lower per capita productivity. There's a lot of innovation in the U.S., which is supported by the legal system. The U.S. is already the world's largest economy by 1894, and so far has not lost that advantage. And even where China might surpass the U.S. would be more autonomous than China in the two key areas of energy production and food production. The U.S. has a lot of arable land and the technology to exploit energy within its own borders. And so it has a lot more autonomy, and it's much more insulated than China from other countries. And of course, it has a huge advantage in that it's essentially dominating the North American continent. Mexico has a tiny fraction of the power generated by the U.S. and has chosen a path in foreign policy that is completely non-threatening to the U.S. And Canada shares many values and is consequently a close ally, at least in the liberal sense. So the U.S. made a switch in the 1890s from a continental land power, once it had consolidated control of North America, including the purchase of Alaska and the neutralization of Spain in South America, to a naval power. And it switched then further to a littoral land power, meaning a country able to move enormous militaries across the ocean to fight in other areas. And the U.S. did this with the Torch landings in North Africa, the Normandy landings in Europe and at Salerno in Italy, its interventions in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, its interventions and landings in New Guinea, the Philippines, in the Ryukyu Islands, the deployment of 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. So the U.S. is able to move through a very efficient transport and logistical system, an enormous amount of power through its allies in other parts of the world, which is dangerous for other countries. Because if they move a large army abroad and are isolated, they could be caused to surrender. And this is what happened. The French and the Spanish fleets were able to isolate the British Army during the American War of Independence, causing the British to surrender and grant the U.S. its independence. There's a big debate as to whether the U.S. has reached its limit or whether further success is possible. It was thought that the British would go into decline after the American War of Independence, but the British just got even more powerful. Because after the Americans became independent and the British lost their wealthiest colony, the British stumbled across mass industrialization and were able to then scramble for colonies in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. These individuals here show one of the powerful institutional aspects of American culture. One of the reasons the U.S. is so successful is that it's able to bring in immigrants from other parts of the world that have high talents and to use them even in areas as narrow as its military services. So during the Second World War, General Eisenhower, who was the highest ranking American army officer in Europe, was of German descent. And Admiral Nimitz, who commanded the fleets in the Pacific against Japan and was the highest ranking officer in the Pacific theater, again was German. So the Americans turn immigrants even from the countries that they're attacking against that country because of the attractiveness of its value system. You can here see General Eric Shinseki, who's Japanese, who's in charge of the U.S. military. One of the reasons China's never boasted having put the first Chinese astronaut in space is because far and away the first Chinese astronauts and the second and the third have all been Chinese Americans. So in terms of policy recommendations, the Chinese interpretation of that study was first internal unity. It's absolutely important that the people in China follow in step and do not engage in dissension against the goals of the government. Now, this is problematic. My instinct is, having lived through the 70s and 80s and looked at how the Warsaw Pact collapsed and looked at various people movements, you cannot control people as easily as many of these authoritarian governments think. And these governments, however much they monitor the internet or monitor their population's conversations on phones, they simply create a culture where people hide their true sentiments, and the collapse has come dramatically and in a step-level fashion. So without any forewarning until a crisis happens and people have to make an abrupt decision. China learned that market mechanisms matter, and this is not only for efficiency, but also because that's what creates the wealth that populations in China deem important to make them more wealthy. Third, ideological, scientific, and institutional innovation. You can create organizations to steal science, and you can do some basic science yourself, but it's going to be slower than it is in a system with a more efficient legal system like the U.S., which encourages innovation in its universities and then rewards people. Japan per capita has among the largest, if not the largest per capita number of Nobel Prizes, but a very large number of Japanese Nobel Prize winners work in the U.S. because that's where they can commercialize their thoughts. China is far behind Japan, even in the 21st century, in terms of innovation. And finally, international peace. China's goal is to be powerful, not at war. And so provoking a series of interests that result in conflict will undermine China's ability to secure the wealth that it needs to maintain the legitimacy of the Communist Party in China.